Have you ever noticed that the smartest person in the room usually isn't the one that's talking the most? Instead, it's often the person who's quietly listening while everyone else is trying to be heard. Now, before we go any further, being quiet doesn't automatically make someone intelligent, actually. Some people are just naturally more on the quiet side, maybe because they're shy, nervous, or simply don't have much to say. And there are plenty of brilliant people who are outgoing and love to talk. There's a kind of silence that's usually learned rather than inherited. It's not awkward silence, rather it's intentional silence. Over time, smart people eventually realize something that many people don't notice when they're younger. Conversations isn't just about exchanging information, they're about revealing information. Every time someone speaks, they're giving away a little piece of themselves without realizing it. The topics that they obsess over, the things that trigger them, the stories that they repeat, even the words that they choose, all points towards who they really are. Their personality eventually becomes predictable. And what's interesting is that most people aren't just paying attention to what you're saying. Instead, they are just standing there, waiting for their turn to talk. Think about the last group conversation that you were in. There was probably someone who interrupted constantly because they couldn't stand not being heard. Someone who agreed with everyone just to avoid conflict, and someone who somehow turned every topic back to themselves. Those behaviors tell you far more about a person than the actual words that they're saying. That's one of the biggest advantages of staying quiet. When you're not focused on what you're going to say next, you start noticing a pattern that everyone else misses. Patterns are much harder to fake than words. Anyone can sound confident at any point. Anyone can claim that they're honest, loyal, or hardworking. But given enough time, their habits expose the truth. Consistent behavior always speaks louder than confident claims. That's why intelligent people so often speak less. Not because they don't have anything to say, but because they understand that every conversation is giving them two choices. They can spend it trying to impress people, or they can spend it trying to understand them. And more often than not, understanding people is the better investment. Many people mistakenly believe that intelligent people hold back their opinions out of fear of saying something wrong. In many cases, this can be true, but more often than not, they're quiet because they learned that not every thought needs to be spoken. When we're young, we often feel the need to prove ourselves. If we know the answer, we want everyone to see that we know it. When someone says something we disagree with, we rush to correct them. Every conversation starts to feel like a competition where we're trying to come out on top. Over time, that mindset starts to change. You realize that being right doesn't always accomplish anything. Think about how many arguments you've seen where both people walked away even more convinced that they were correct. Facts alone rarely change someone's mind when emotions and personal beliefs are involved. It's not about what's factual, it's about their identity. The moment someone feels that their intelligence, experience, or beliefs are being challenged, they stop listening. Their goal shifts from understanding to defending themselves. Once you notice that pattern, something interesting happens. Rather than asking yourself, can I win this argument? You start asking, is this person actually interested in changing their mind? Those are two completely different questions. If the answer is no, continuing the conversation usually isn't productive. You're no longer exchanging ideas anymore at that point. You're basically just taking turns speaking. That's why some of the smartest people you'll meet don't feel the need to have the last word. They've learned that silence can communicate something words will never will. In their minds, they can say, I'm comfortable enough with what I know that I don't need your agreement. Ironically, the people who are most desperate to prove that they're intelligent are often the ones who reveal the most insecurity. Real confidence doesn't need constant confirmation. It doesn't rush into every debate or compete to be the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, the strongest position is simply knowing which conversations are worth having and quietly walking away from the rest. Another thing that changes with experience is how people start to understand uncertainty. When you're younger, most things feel very black and white. Someone is either right or wrong, smart or dumb, progressing or failing. There's a kind of confidence in that simplicity, but the more you actually pay attention to the world, the less simple it becomes. You start noticing how often the right answer depends on context, how often two people can look at the same situation and both be partially correct, how often what seems obvious at first turns out to have layers you didn't see before. And slowly, the way you think starts to change. Instead of saying, this is how it is, you start saying, it depends. Instead of jumping to conclusions, you start to hold yourself back a little bit. Not because you're unsure of everything, but because you've seen enough to know that certainty is often oversold. This is one of the quiet reasons intelligent people speak less. It's not that they're hesitating, it's more about calibration. They've learned that speaking too quickly often means speaking too simplistically. And once you simplify things too much, you stop describing reality and start describing a version of reality that just sounds good. There's also another side to this. The more you understand how complex things are, the more you realize how little most conversations can actually capture. If you think about it for a minute, you can't fully explain complicating ideas, life experiences, or even simple decisions in a few sentences without losing something important. So instead of trying to compress everything into a quick opinion, some people just don't bother unless it's worth the effort, because they know that most casual conversations aren't built for depth anyways. They're built for speed. And speed usually comes at the cost of accuracy. So silence starts to become like a filter. Not everything deserves to be simplified, and not everything deserves a quick answer. And also, not every opinion needs to be broadcast in real time. Sometimes, the most accurate response is simply taking a moment longer before speaking or not speaking at all. That's something a lot of people misread. They assume silence means nothing is happening, but often than not, it's the complete opposite. It's someone noticing more than they're saying. There's also something people don't really talk about when it comes to why smart people stay quiet. It's not just about thinking more, it's about seeing how people react when you speak. At some point, you start noticing a pattern. The same idea could come out of your mouth, but the reaction changes completely depending on who's listening, how they feel that day, or even who else is in that room. You might say something thoughtful, something neutral, something you didn't even think was controversial, and suddenly the energy shifts. Somebody gets defensive, someone else agrees too quickly just to stay aligned with the group, and another person laughs a little louder than necessary. And you realize something important. Most reactions aren't really about your words. They're about how people interpret those words and what it means about them. That changes how you speak. Not in a cautious, fearful way, but in a more selective way. You stop assuming that every thought needs to be shared immediately because you've seen what happens when ideas are dropped into the wrong environment. Sometimes they're understood well by others. Other times they're twisted, warped, or taken the wrong way, leaving people offended. And sometimes they're just ignored entirely, not because they're wrong, but because they don't fit the moment. So silence becomes a matter of timing. You start thinking more about when to speak, not just what to say. And most people really and truly underestimate how powerful timing is in communication. The same sentence can land completely differently depending on the context, the mood, and even who spoke before you. That's another reason intelligent people are often quieter. Instead of reacting to everything around them, they take the time to observe before deciding whether their input would add value. After being misunderstood enough times, they learn that some situations simply aren't receptive to clarity. You also start noticing something else, how quickly conversations move on. People rarely sit with ideas for long. A topic comes up, everyone gives a surface level opinion, and then the group moves on. There's very little space for depth unless someone intentionally slows it down. And most people don't want to slow things down because that feels too boring and requires more mental energy. What they want is flow, energy, and momentum. So if you're someone who naturally thinks more deeply, you eventually learn that speaking all the time doesn't help you communicate better. It often just makes you repeat yourself in environments that aren't really listening. That's when silence stops becoming something passive and starts becoming more of an art of control. Not control over other people, obviously, but control over your own energy, your own attention, and the moments you choose to invest in. Because once you've seen enough conversations play out, you realize something simple but important. Not every moment needs your input, and not every silence needs to be filled.